Welcome everybody to our second session for Thursday. I'm Beth Holtzman with the University of Vermont Extension Women's Ag Network, and I'm going to be moderating the Assessing Legal Issues for Farm and Ranch Women session. And our presenter is Erin Parker. She serves as the Assistant Director of the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative at the University of Arkansas School of Law. She supports the initiative through program development, writing, research, and analysis of regulatory issues affecting tribal governments, business, and producers. She's the lead person on our project's legal team, which is developing educational resources about legal issues related to land tenure, contracting, liability, and employment, including sexual harassment on farms. And as she says in her bio, and I've experienced, she is happy to talk with anyone endlessly about pretty much anything having to do with ag and food law. And I would add entertainingly. I always enjoy talking with Erin. So welcome, Erin, and I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you so much, Beth. I will do my best to be entertaining. As I was saying to Mary before the break, I just so appreciated Audra's presentation. It was just so warm and wonderful, and what a great way to start the last day of our virtual conference by seeing images of all of these women who are working in agriculture right now. I'm a little sad to follow that up with a legal talk, walking through laws, but I'll do my best to do what Beth said and be entertaining. I wanted to give you a little bit of an overview of today's talk before we start walking through it. I'm going to be highlighting some situations where technical service providers may want to recommend a lawyer for the farmer or rancher that they may be working with. And I was thinking about this while Audra was talking, just about the loss of women in ag before 1978, before we were even looking at the data for women in agriculture. What she said about loans that weren't given and operations that were never started and that kind of thing. And hopefully today, with some of the situations that I'm going to highlight, we can highlight some spaces where maybe the law can work for women in agriculture and not against them, and keep women farming and ranching and prosperous in agriculture. So that's my goal for today and for the presentation today. A little bit about me. Beth told you a little bit. I am here in Arkansas, where it is cold today, just like it is cold everywhere else around the country, but I won't complain too much because we're not below zero. So we are here at the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative. We exist to support tribal governments, tribal food businesses, tribal farmers and ranchers, fishermen, anybody in the food system. We do a lot of technical support. We do strategic planning for food businesses. We do policy analysis and legal analysis to support food systems in Indian country. And I'm delighted to be here with you today and be a part of the Women in Ag team with all of the wonderful women who've helped put this conference together. So that's a little bit about me. I do have to start with an obligatory disclaimer. This presentation is educational. It's not intended as legal advice, and being here with this presentation, attending, viewing, reading, doesn't mean that you and I have an attorney-client relationship. And if you have any circumstances that you're thinking about today that arise from this presentation, some of the issues that I'm going to highlight, if those are relevant to you or to a farmer or rancher that you work with, I would strongly recommend that you seek the advice of legal counsel to deal with those issues, because indeed that is what all of today's presentation is going to be about. So enough with the dry disclaimer. Audra actually did a beautiful job of setting this up, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. Just a little bit about why we're here and why we do this work. Women farmers predate America. Indigenous women have been farming since time immemorial. She showed some photos of some Indigenous farming women during her presentation and talked a little bit about the work that they're doing at Tohono O'odham Nation, and talked a little bit also about this 14% of principal operators who are female farmers and the 7% of farmland that they cover. So I don't want to belabor that point, but I'm delighted that that we have that data point and look forward to new data hopefully soon from National Agricultural Statistics Service, so that we can continue to build out our work to support women farmers and ranchers. So food and ag law and policy, I wanted to start with a little bit of a hierarchy of law and just give you kind of an overview of the many different kinds of laws that may give rise to some of the legal situations that I'm going to be discussing today. Laws affecting agricultural production, as I'm sure you know, regardless of who the producer is, come from a variety of different sources. Here we can see there's some implications even in international law, certainly in federal law. We have farm bills, the most recent Agricultural Act of 2018 being the most recent farm bill that we have, but going all the way back to the Agricultural Adjustment Act of 1933, we have federal law and policy around agriculture in this country. We also have laws that aren't directly relevant always to agriculture, but absolutely have an impact on the ability of people to make a living doing farming. That includes the Food Safety Modernization Act, which was passed in 2011. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. There are plenty of other federal laws, certainly, though, that also have implications for agricultural production, natural resources laws, environmental law. There's law around intellectual property that may have some implications for food and agriculture production, all of these things. And then certainly, of course, state and tribal laws. We have most of our domestic laws in the United States are really going to be found at the state level that have implications for agriculture and agricultural producers. There are tribes also all over this country who are formulating and adopting new laws and regulations in the space of food and agriculture and really driving food systems change in Indian country. We see there are 576 federally recognized tribes all over the country many of whom are active in the space of food and agriculture. So there are also agricultural laws at the tribal level. And in addition to that, those are just laws that are specific to agriculture. There are state and tribal laws around contracts, dissolution of marriage and what happens to property upon divorce, real and personal property, commercial sales, and so many more things that are also going to frequently be present at the state and local level that impact agricultural production and sales that we have to think about when we're helping farmers and ranchers. Local and municipalities may also have some laws that impact ag, and that's especially going to be true maybe in a direct marketing context if you're working with somebody who's selling to a farmer's market, as so many of the women pictured in Audra's presentation were people who are doing any kind of local sourcing to local restaurants. There may be local health codes and that kind of thing that have something to say about how food moves around in a local food system in a legal way. So all of these different kinds of laws come together to sort of form a framework around whatever a farmer or rancher is doing. And sometimes that can be a little impenetrable, and it can also sometimes be a little difficult, I think, to identify a legal issue before it becomes a problem instead of after, to try to prevent a problem or maybe mitigate some of the effects before the problem becomes very before you get to court, basically. This presentation is really about highlighting some of those key areas where problems may arise and how a service provider may want to go about recommending to a farmer or rancher that they're working with that they seek the advice of an agricultural or food attorney. Agricultural and food attorneys do exist. I am one. I can prove it. We're going to talk a little bit later in the presentation about how to find us if you have a farmer or rancher that you're working with you think really needs to talk to an attorney about any of the situations that we're going to talk about today or anything else that comes up in your day-to-day work. A lot of the legal issues that I'm going to be talking about today also, they impact farmers and ranchers really regardless of gender. However, I think that it's worth noting that sometimes when we're working with women or other socially disadvantaged groups of agricultural producers, I think what we know, just because of the societal framework that we have to work within, where we still deal with discrimination, where we still deal with harassment, when legal issues arise for people in marginalized groups, it can be harder than it would be for somebody else to recover. So it's extra important, I think, to maybe try to stop some of these problems before they start and find solutions to them. So not all of this may be solely related to just women, but it may affect people of all genders who are farming or ranching. But I think that maybe the disparate impacts and the ability to recover later kind of necessitates a more thorough walkthrough sometimes. So just as a general overview, I tried to think through and talk to my team and some other folks about just anecdotal situations that come up sometimes, like when you might want to recommend speaking with a lawyer. So here are a few examples. the farmers are, I'm not going to read through all of these. I'm just going to kind of hit the highlights, and we'll pick some of them up as we go through some of the big topic areas in my presentation. But if the farmer or rancher that you're working with wants to do any of these things, has a need for any of these things, that may be a point where you might want to say, hey, you know what, it might be a good idea if you just speak to an attorney about this, just to see what your liability is, what your responsibilities are, how we can mitigate your risk around this so that you can save money and keep your operation up and running. There are a lot of different areas of law that are involved in every single one of these bullet points, but there's plenty of situations that I think come up all the time where maybe recommending speaking with a lawyer is good. Anybody who's selling a farm business, certainly dividing assets and managing debts can trigger the need for an attorney. Somebody who wants to do agritourism, we're going to talk about that in a little bit. People who have interns or volunteers on the farm to work may imply some agricultural labor law that they might want to walk through before they have people there, just to protect themselves and protect their operation and protect those people too. Because this isn't just about protecting the farm and protecting the operation, it's also about protecting the other people in the food system that your farmer or rancher is interacting with. There are plenty of other things that that would trigger maybe speaking with a lawyer, but I just wanted to give you sort of a brief list before we started walking through some of these subject matter areas. So this is the structure of the topics that I'm going to talk about today. We've selected these agricultural law topics just because these are buckets of law that we get questions about a lot here at the initiative. And so I wanted to walk through some of these things with you today. These areas are, every single one of these areas we could spend an entire day on. We could spend way more than 50 minutes on. So I'm not going to cover all of the legal issues, the possible legal issues in every single one of these. We'd be here for at least 10 days. And I know everybody's busy. So as Beth said, I could probably talk about it all day, but and for the next 10 days, but I will keep us to 50 minutes, and I'll just give a few examples in each of these buckets as we walk through. So starting with business structures, and I start with business structures because there are so many legal issues that really turn on the type of business structure that the farmer ranch is. The solutions, the negative externalities that are sometimes associated with the risks of these legal issues, all of them will revolve around the type of entity that the farmer or rancher has chosen to organize their business. Different kinds of business structures, as I'm sure many of you know, come with different kinds of legal status, come with different trade-offs in terms of your liability, your tax structure and tax implications, and many other things as well. So just to give a brief overview of some business structures in the US right now, most farms, almost 87% of farms really, are operating as sole proprietorships, which means they're operating without some of the safety nets that some of these other kinds of corporations that we have as creatures of state law now can offer to farmers or ranchers. So if you're working with somebody and they're thinking about starting a business, when you're starting is a great time to talk about business structure because you haven't done anything yet, right? Maybe bringing the possibility of talking to an attorney about looking at different trade-offs for kinds of business structure that you can use would be a good idea when someone is starting up. But it's never too late. You can transition from sole proprietorship into a different kind of business structure. During your operation, that's fine. But it may be a space where you want to recommend that they talk to an agricultural attorney because, as we all know, there are some peculiarities of agriculture and agricultural law that may necessitate a specialized look at how best to protect their operation and keep them viable and earning. So if you look at the different kinds of business structures that we have out there, this is just a very brief overview, and I'm grateful to Vermont Law School for this handy guide. I promised before we started there wouldn't be any Excel. I didn't make any promises about not having a chart, so I hope a chart is okay. You can see here that there's a lot of different types of business entities, from sole proprietorships, which again, 87% of farms in the US are using right now. There are also things like general partnerships, LLCs, or limited liability companies, corporations, different kinds of corporations. There's S Corps, there's C Corps. there's nonprofits, there are cooperatives. All of these are different business structures. And as you can see from the chart, there are different kinds of liability, there are different kinds of taxation. The ability to transfer the business to someone else is different in each of these buckets. And your ability to raise capital for your operation is different depending on the structure sometimes as well. So all of these are considerations where if you've got somebody starting a business or they're thinking about restructuring their business, bringing in an attorney, especially somebody who has both legal and or both agricultural and tax expertise, can be a really good idea to help your farmer or rancher sort through the many different options that they have. And that's going to be state specific. So you're going to want to find somebody who's licensed in your jurisdiction, in your state, because all of these things pretty much turn on state law. This isn't a federal determination. This is going to be something that your state has passed into law. So talking to somebody from your jurisdiction will be pretty important. And we'll talk at the end of the presentation about how to find an ag lawyer where you are. Just generally more on business structures, there's just a lot of questions, as I said at the beginning, that turn on what kind of business structure you want. And all of these questions that are here when you're thinking about ownership and operation of a farm matter and will kind of help a farmer determine maybe what business structure is best. Whether or not you have a partner or a family member sharing in the farm ownership, how much of the farm ownership they are going to be sharing, what everybody's bringing to the business, whether you have family members who are interested in taking over that business. All of these things are things that are going to affect personal assets potentially. And when you're thinking about what kind of business structure to use, one of the things that a lawyer can help a farmer or rancher walk through is really how to protect their personal assets from any kind of problem that arises in the business. So this is a situation where if you had a different corporate structure that wasn't a sole proprietorship, and you did have a financial obligation or something that came to the business and was going to cause a lot of hardship for the business and they wanted to close down, potentially the way that you have your corporate structure set up can protect you from losing like a house or something else that you have tied to your land instead of just your business. So instead of the whole thing rather. So talking to a lawyer can really help you kind of work out some of those things and figure out what structure is actually going to be best. I know nobody wants to think about death, divorce, taxes, or agricultural market collapse. Lawyers have to think about those things for our clients, and those are all situations where legal planning ahead of time can save a farmer or rancher's operation later down the road. I know sometimes it's a hard sell to get somebody to come and talk to an attorney about any of those issues, but there really is a little bit of planning can really limit a lot of personal liability later, can determine how your taxes are impacted, how your debt could possibly be restructured, if there was financial hardship, what the sale of the business looks like, and who your contracts are with. All of that is involved in business structure choice. So talking to an attorney just right off the bat about business structure may be a good idea.
Erin, can I chime in for a moment?
Absolutely.
So I think that I'm someone who talks with my hands also, and I think we might be picking up a little bit of background noise from. Yeah, are you wearing? I can't tell if you have a bracelet on or something, or
it's my sweater probably. I'll try to limit my hand use.
Okay. And also we have one question coming in, and I don't know if you want to take questions as we're going along or if you prefer to have them at the end.
If we could hold them to the end, that might be good, because there's a lot of overlap, I think, in some of the subjects, so things may come up that impact the answer later.
Okay, we'll do that.
And I'm talking with my hands already. Again, I see it. Well, I'm gonna take them to my desk. Thank you for letting me know. I appreciate that.
Okay, well, carry on, please.
Sure. So the second big area that I wanted to jump into is just kind of a general liability discussion, because this is also a situation where a lot of legal liability or legal risk arises for farmers and ranchers. So just generally speaking, liability just means how much you are responsible under the law for what you do. That's what liability is. For farmers and ranchers, obviously, there's a lot of different kinds of liability. A lot of different activities can give rise to legal liability, including just plain old operating a farm or ranch. That's why we have a lot of right to farm laws that arose to keep people from getting nuisance lawsuits, especially as we've had a lot of folks moving out of metro counties into more rural areas, nearer to farms and nearer to ranches, where they're maybe unfamiliar with the sights and the smells and the noises of farm life. And because of that, we've seen a lot of nuisance lawsuits popping up over the last 20, 30 years as people have moved from cities to more rural areas. So just as a general liability standpoint, nuisance lawsuits can come up, and that can be a place where if you have a farmer or rancher who is experiencing complaints from their neighbors already, then maybe talking to an attorney before any kind of lawsuit arises can help them limit their liability and protect their operation. This happens frequently. I mean, I think there was just a big case in North Carolina, for example. I think some pork farmers who were sued under nuisance law for odor and noise, among other things. So that may be a situation, if you've got neighbors who are complaining, you want to recommend that your farmer or your rancher talk to an attorney about nuisance law. Liability, just in general, again, not to go back to our previous discussion too much, but liability is a concern for farmers also because of the sole proprietorship and the business structure that can really impact that can really impact how much of the farmer or rancher's personal assets are at risk if there is a lawsuit for anything, not just nuisance. So these two topics are kind of related. There's a lot of other types of farm liability, though, that farmers and ranchers may want to think about, including agritourism. So if you have folks who have visitors frequently to their farm or their ranch, or they want to get started having visitors, that includes if they're doing farm tours, ranch tours. Like I know we work with some folks locally who have students who come a lot to their farm to tour their farm and their operation. We have a couple of farms here on campus that people come to all the time just to walk through and see what's going on. We have corn mazes, pumpkin patches. I know farmers who lease or allow people onto their lands periodically when they're not in production for like mudders or races and that kind of thing. So they have people who've been invited onto their land. And when you invite somebody onto your land in the law, we call those people invitees. So that's easy, right? Generally, those are people who are there with permissions. We're not talking about trespassers. We're just talking about people who have been invited. And because they've been invited, the law says, generally speaking, that we have to be really careful with how we have them on our land. It means they need to be warned of any potential dangers. You have to keep everything pretty safe for them in the areas where they're going to be. And all of this, again, is going to turn on what the law is in your state. Different jurisdictions are going to have different rules. So if you've got a farmer or rancher who wants to do any of these things and thinking through that with an attorney and talking with an attorney about what the guidelines are in your state, and particularly around how you're allowed to warn people. Like some states have different rules for the font that can be on a sign. For example, it has to be a certain pitch of font, or the sign has to be placed in a certain place, or they won't consider it to have adequately warned a visitor about danger. So if you have somebody on the farm who's visiting for any of these reasons or other reasons, that can increase legal liability for a farmer or rancher. And they could risk losing a lawsuit if they're not following some of the agritourism guidelines that exist in the state law or the tribe where they're operating. So just talking to an attorney about that and making sure that they're complying with the law to keep their liability lower is a good idea. And visitors to the farm can also impact food safety. So food safety, we've got a big new law, the FSMA, Food Safety Modernization Act, that was passed in 2011. It made a lot of sweeping changes to our food safety regulation in this country. It was probably the most sweeping change that has been made in the last 30 years. And we've pushed food safety regulation right onto the farm through FSMA, especially for the produce safety rule. Some rules that also, there are 7 major rules that are associated with FSMA that the Food and Drug Administration has come out with since the law was passed. Specifically for this presentation, I figured the produce safety rule, there's a human food rule, and an animal feed rule. Those 3 are going to have the biggest legal implications probably for the farmers and ranchers that we're working with and the operations that we're working with. All of those rules have exemptions. All of them have exemptions that are based on sales. Some of them, if they fall below a certain sales threshold per year, they don't have to comply with the law at all. However, as I noted here on the slide, just because you're exempt from FSMA or you don't have to comply with FSMA doesn't mean that you are exempt from general food safety law, from product liability law, commercial code, consumer protection. There's a whole range and suite of laws at the state level that if somebody does get sick with a foodborne illness and they are trying to figure out how they were injured and lawsuits are filed, all of those things still operate whether FSMA is in play or not. So when you have visitors on the farm, one of the things that an attorney can help you walk through is making sure that your visitors are not in a place where they're going to put you sideways with any kind of food safety regulations. Because if you've got people, for example, if you had like maybe chickens in one part of your operation and you had a greenhouse with fresh lettuce or like an open field with any kind of leafy green and you have people on a farm tour, you're going to want to make them walk through the greens first and end with the chickens and not the other way around, because that's going to increase your food safety risk for foodborne illness from tracking chicken litter potentially into the greens. Obviously, that's something that technical service providers help with all the time, just figuring out the legal piece and making sure that you're complying with any kind of legal regulation that's come out under FSMA or any kind of protection that you can get from general food safety law or products liability law. That may be something that will trigger talking to an attorney. There are a couple of different things in here that I wanted to highlight quickly before we move on to the next topic about food safety. Just when you're talking to a farmer or rancher about food safety, there are some ways to mitigate legal risk, and there may be some opportunity to talk to an attorney about that to really help manage that legal risk. One of those is any kind of regulator review or any kind of voluntary audit that happens under a federal food safety law like the FSMA. I know people are doing on-farm readiness reviews right now. There are a lot of people out there who are doing on-farm readiness reviews who aren't even going to have to comply with the law, but they're thinking about scaling their business up in the next few years. And so they're looking forward and thinking that they may need to comply in a few years because their sales will be above the low limit that they will have to comply with the produce safety rule, for example. Anytime you have a regulator on your farm, though, that is going to potentially increase your liability. So one of the things you may want to recommend is having an attorney present if anybody's going to do any kind of voluntary review like that, just to make sure that they're as protected as they can be. Also, just generally talking to an attorney about how to figure out if a farmer or rancher has to comply with FSMA, if they are exempt, and some of the exemptions have special rules that you have to follow, and extra steps that you have to take in terms of labeling, for example, for products under FSMA if you're exempt. So talking to an attorney to help you just kind of figure out what those things may be for your farmer or rancher may kind of expedite their process and help them understand their liability under the law and how they need to comply with these rules that have just come out under this new law that we have. Also, just generally for general food safety law, not talking about FSMA, if you've got folks who are selling into food hubs, sometimes that can aggregate liability because you have all of your producers selling into one central spot. So if there is a problem with food safety, if there is a foodborne illness outbreak, the easier thing to do for an attorney for somebody who's been injured in that foodborne illness is to just sue everybody in the food hub, because sometimes it can be hard to figure out exactly which produce comes from which farm once everything's kind of aggregated there in the food hub. Depending on how labeling and everything else goes, sometimes you can mitigate that, but again, talking to an attorney about that may be a good idea. So I'm going to run out of time if I don't keep going. So moving on to environmental law, just really quickly. Environmental law obviously is going to overlap with agricultural production in a lot of ways. We can talk about pesticide use, about water quality, irrigation, and air. Water quality in particular is going to have some overlap with the food safety discussion that we just had, because the Food Safety Modernization Act produce safety rule has a lot to say about water quality, about water testing, especially looking for pathogenic E. coli in water that's being used to grow fresh produce that's going to the fresh market. All of that is going to overlap a little bit. Certainly there are major federal statutes out there that cover the entire country when it comes to environmental law. Some of them, like the Clean Water Act, have some specific exemptions carved out for agriculture. But just in general, like there is definitely a lot of overlap with federal environmental law and agricultural law, and states and tribes and counties may also have some environmental law, some environmental standards that are going to impact growing and raising animals anywhere in the country. But it's not just really regulatory problems that I wanted to talk about with environmental law, because a lot of that's going to be implicated with the Environmental Protection Agency. A lot of those federal statutes are. But what I really wanted to bring up here is that if you've got somebody, for example, who is going to lease some land to farm or ranch, and they've got a contract that they're entering into with somebody else to sell their goods that they are growing or raising on that farm or ranch land, part of what they may want to consider when they're looking at their leasing agreement is what kind of pesticide they can use, when it can be applied. All of those kinds of things can be dealt with in a leasing agreement to prevent legal hurt down the line if the landowner didn't want you to use a certain kind of pesticide, for example, and you don't have a protection in your lease. That can be a difficulty, certainly, for somebody down the line. So there's some overlap here with property in terms of leasing agreements and with contracts in terms of sales, especially around like pesticides. So you've got environmental law in one space and the property and contracts in another space. And a lawyer can really help a farmer or rancher kind of walk through that tangled web and figure out what the best path forward is for that particular person's operation. I mentioned property just now. I'll dig into that a little bit more. I didn't want to spend too much time on estate planning because I feel like it's really hard to talk to anybody about estate planning. Again, as I said, nobody wants to talk about death, but also I think that attorneys are pretty well filling that space in terms of making sure that they're working with people so that their wills are valid and filed. That if people are getting wills, I think a lot of the time they are using attorneys, they are using legal clinics to help them figure out what their wills need to look like and how to do that. The hard part is getting people to want to do that. But beyond that, there are other issues with property law that I think may also necessitate perhaps some legal advice if you have somebody who's working on any of these issues. If you have people who are trying to be joint tenants or tenants in common on the land, and they're kind of sharing the land and they have that kind of structure, depending on the type of tenancy they're trying to use, there may be some specific and very deliberate legal requirements that have to be met, or a court maybe later would find that that tenancy did not exist. And a lawyer can actually look at the law in your jurisdiction and help your farmer or rancher figure out exactly how to form the entity that they're trying to form so that they're protected down the road. That can really cause problems, especially with some overlap with estate planning here. That can cause problems if one of the tenants passes away and they thought that they had it all set up so that the other tenant would then have more interest in the property than they actually do because all of the requirements for that tenancy have not been legally met. So just to protect people, anytime you're dealing with tenancy, I would maybe recommend an attorney. Heirs property is also a pretty specific legal issue. I don't know if anyone here is dealing with farmers and ranchers who have to deal with heirs property. This is going to be for Black farmers and ranchers, and pretty much for farmers. This is a significant contributor to land loss. It's a holdover from I won't go into the entire history of heirs property, but basically what it's led to is a lot of land fractionation because when poor Black farmers passed away, they didn't have the ability to have a will. Then as the will was going through the court system, the courts would just deem it to pass to their heirs and then on to those people's heirs, and so on and so on and so forth until now. Today, we have a lot of patches of land that may have 1,000 people who have interests in it. And there was a solution in the farm bill that actually got passed that helps some of this, but heirs property is a really tricky legal scenario. So definitely, if you have anybody who's dealing with heirs property, I would recommend an attorney. And in the citations to this presentation, I have a couple of centers that can help folks specifically with heirs property. There's the Land Loss Prevention Project and the Center for Heirs Property Preservation. Both of those are linked in my presentation and would be great resources if you've got anybody who's dealing with that kind of issue right now. I talked a little bit about contracts when I talked about environmental law, but certainly anytime a farmer or rancher is involved in signing a contract, it may be a good idea to have an attorney review it if that's possible. But even the most simple of contracts can possibly raise a lot of legal questions, specifically around liability and who is responsible for what if something goes wrong. So for livestock contracts, you might want to talk about what happens if there are unhealthy animals. Is the buyer going to reject those? What's the remedy for the producer in that circumstance? Thinking through environmental rules the rancher must comply with under the terms of the contract. Who has control of all of the inputs? Is the rancher able to go buy things locally or source things locally, or are there specific inputs that the contract is going to put on that rancher to buy very specific inputs for their operation? Just general legal protections that the contract can offer if something goes wrong. And similarly for produce contracts, looking at just a lot of this is very disaster focused, because that's what kind of mitigating risk is all about, right? Like if something goes terribly wrong, how do we try to make sure that the loss is minimal? And that's the same in a contract situation. I mean, for produce contracts, thinking like if there's a harvest that's absolutely impossible because it's -50 and you can't get out to harvest, for example, other kinds of disasters like wildfires and that sort of thing. What happens under the terms of the contract? Does the contract have any provision for that? If it doesn't, then have an attorney looking at it and trying to figure out how to negotiate with the other party to get that in there can be a good idea. Just generally, there's a ton more questions that you can look at, and there's some resources in the notes about production contracts and a legal guide to production contracts. All of those things can kind of help people walk through what's in their contract and what might not be in their contract that maybe should be, so really make sure that they're protected as much as they can be in the event that something goes wrong. And so that may be a good situation to have an attorney come in and look at those contracts. Anytime we have people working on the farm, obviously we've got some labor issues potentially. So if you've got people who are hiring workers, just generally federal law is going to require that people have insurance if they're driving anybody around or transporting workers around. State laws may or may not require this, and may also require workers' compensation insurance as well. The OSHA rules, either both federal or like state departments that are regulating in that area as well, sometimes have very specific standards for farm labor machinery and equipment in particular. There's some examples here on the slide, like rollover structures for tractors. Those are some things that may or may not be required to make sure that workers are protected on the farm. State laws also usually have some pretty tight worker safety rules, and often these do apply to agricultural employers as well, to provide safe working conditions. So that may be a situation if you've got volunteers, if you've got interns coming onto the farm, even if they're not paid, they may still be considered workers under those legal provisions. And a lawyer can let somebody know pretty quickly if that's the case, and then what requirements may be put on them to make sure that they're complying with the law. And the way to manage risk just generally in a lot of these areas, we recommend insurance a lot of the time. An attorney can kind of walk through that as well. And I know that that's another service that technical service providers also absolutely are involved in. This is just one of these risk mitigation situations. The place in here where I would say it might be good to talk to an attorney is if you're filing insurance claims, or you have claims filed against you, not necessarily for crop loss or that kind of thing, but just in other areas of insurance. I wanted to talk a little bit about direct marketing because I know a lot of women farmers in particular do a lot of direct marketing or doing a lot of farmers markets. We saw so many pictures in Audra's presentation as an example of that, of women at farmers markets. And really, when you're talking about direct marketing, like directly selling to consumers, the issues that can arise there legally, really potentially any of the topics that we've covered today, but for sure, food safety liability and contracts are maybe two of the things that are going to be most likely there. So if you've got somebody who's doing some direct marketing, especially around food safety, trying to figure out how FSMA fits in there and how the produce safety rule fits in there, may be a good idea to talk to an attorney about, especially if you've got a farmer who is exempt from FSMA, because some of the requirements for some of the exemptions require a farmer to display a sign at their farm stand that they're exempt from FSMA. Like that's one of the exemptions has that in there. So just making sure if they are saying they're exempt from FSMA, then that they're complying with it fully and having that sign out there as well. And an attorney can look through that. And there are also some good resources out there. The National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition has a chart helping people kind of walk through preliminarily whether or not they may or may not be exempt from the law, but then taking that a step further and just maybe running it by an attorney to make sure that you're complying and your analysis is correct could be a good idea to potentially keep people out of any bad regulatory situations. So the last topic that I wanted to cover, and this one absolutely is specific to women, is sexual discrimination and sexual harassment on the farm or the ranch. Unfortunately, dealing with this is a reality for far too many of us in agriculture who are women, whether we're farm and ranch owners and operators, agricultural service providers, farm and ranch laborers. All of this is an unfortunate reality that we deal with. And whether it's discrimination or harassment or both, these situations absolutely necessitate some legal advice to determine rights and remedies. So for farm and ranch owners who maybe want to protect their operations and their employees, one of the ways that you can do that is to develop a discrimination and harassment policy. And I'll talk about that on the next slide. But for survivors and victims of discrimination and harassment, speaking with an attorney can really help figure out maybe a path forward and to get some remedies and know what your rights are under a whole variety of laws, some of which are federal. The EEOC, for example, harassment is considered a form of discrimination by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. So depending on what the discrimination or harassment situation was, talking to an attorney to figure out if you have rights to file a claim under the EEOC to try to get some recovery for the circumstances that happened, that may be a good idea in that particular instance, because that is a protection. There are also some state laws that offer protection as well, and an attorney experienced with employment discrimination or sexual harassment can help walk through that tricky area and determine maybe some recovery and rights for you. Discrimination in lending, I wanted to call out in particular, because you may have rights of appeal if it's public lending. There's the Fair Credit Reform Act. Other federal consumer protection laws around credit and lending have solutions specifically for private lending, and an attorney can help figure out what those options are. And while it's not discriminatory, but somewhat related to financial history and lending, if women may have a really difficult time sometimes, we find, restoring or building credit after a divorce, particularly if their former spouse's credit history is tied up with theirs, if they've been on loans together, if they co-signed on a mortgage. You can see the former spouse sometimes still on a woman's credit report for some time. Talking to an attorney can really expedite the process of restoring that and rebuilding good credit so that that woman can continue to be successful in agriculture or whatever it is that she wants to do. But that's definitely a lingering concern that an attorney can help with. To address sexual harassment on the farm, just quick suggestions for farm and ranch owners who want to try to encourage victims to come forward and report and protect their operation and their liability as well. Having a sexual discrimination and harassment policy that is transparent, that is easy to find and follow, and that your employees are trained on is a really good idea. It's a good way to manage your risk and to encourage people to come forward because they know how to come forward. There are sample policies that are available through technical service providers. I've linked to 5 or 6 of them in my slides in the notes, but I strongly recommend having an attorney look at a specific policy just to make sure that it's complying with any kind of state law. For example, New York has a recent law, I think it was passed last year, that actually requires these policies and has some pretty specific requirements about training, and an attorney can kind of help you walk through what those things may be. In addition to that, the training is probably just a best practice that people can follow to help. So real quick before I close, how do you find an agricultural lawyer? If you have any of these situations, where are we? Here are some good resources for people who want to find agricultural attorneys and food attorneys who can help their farmers and ranchers. The American Association of Agricultural Lawyers, AALA, is a national organization. I'm a member of AALA. Most of the people in my office are. You can find us on the web. I've linked to AALA here. There's an interactive map of all the member attorneys in AALA that you can find on their website, so you can find agricultural attorneys that way. There's also the Farmers Legal Action Group. They've been in existence for over 30 years. They came out of the farm financial crisis in the 1980s. They're a nonprofit law center, and they help people especially with staying on the family farm, staying on land, so debt restructuring and foreclosure, estate planning issues, and FLAG's website has all of their contact information. There's also this Farmers Legal Resource Guide that I've linked here that has a number of different organizations, including Farm Commons, that provide some aid to farmers. And you can also always contact your state bar association if you are looking for an attorney who is in your state and practices agricultural and food law. Every state has a bar association, and they will frequently make referrals if you call and you're looking for somebody who has a particular specialty. So if you need an estate planning attorney, if you need somebody who does food safety, you can call your state bar and get a recommendation that way. So with that, I think I have 5 minutes for questions. So
thank you, Erin. Thank you, Erin. So we have several questions, and I have a couple.
Good.
The first one came in from Mary, and I'm not sure if she was asking you in particular or was hoping to kind of crowdsource from everyone. But the question is, what are your biggest issues in getting clients to seek out legal assistance? Is it that you don't have lawyers in the area, or the client doesn't have the money to hire an attorney? Just curious. So,
well, while everybody thinks about that, I'll say I think money is probably one of the biggest barriers that we see. People are worried about how much legal advice is going to cost, and a dearth of resources in rural areas for sure is also an issue sometimes. But I think money is probably the biggest barrier. I will say a lot of people do consultations for free. Just because when you walk into our office, like, we don't know automatically that we can help you, so we're not going to charge you necessarily for your very first visit. And sometimes it just depends on the case, how cases are structured. Like, there are a lot of cases that may be structured on a fee basis, where like if you only pay a certain amount only if you're successful. Just depends on the circumstance, but money is probably the biggest barrier that we see.
And related to that, we also had a question of, do you have any more concrete examples, numbers, that support paying for a lawyer's advice, or any resources for this that you could recommend? We have a hard time convincing small farmers that lawyers are worth the investment before trouble arises.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things that's hard to study, I think, and that's why a lot of people don't have data on it, because I think what you see is if people don't talk to an attorney, like that's when we hit hard financial times, a lot of the people who haven't talked to an attorney or a tax professional, for example, about their business structure and how to protect themselves and protect their personal assets if their business is impacted by financial hardship. A lot of the times those businesses just go away and they lose not only their livelihood, but sometimes they can lose personal assets like homes as well. And we don't see that that data. I don't think those stories are told because they're not working with anybody. They just they have to close and move away. It's one of the reasons that I was pleased to hear Audra talking to everybody today, because I do think she's doing a great job of highlighting those invisible stories of people who have those problems. I don't have any hard and fast data. I mean, I can tell you, like, I don't have a data point for it, but a lot of the folks who went under in the farm financial crisis of the 80s were sole proprietorships. The people who managed to weather the storm had different corporate business structures. I wish I had better stats, but like I said, I think it's just a situation where it doesn't get studied a lot because people who don't seek legal advice just end up closing shop. So I wish I could help more with that.
So, and I have a couple of related questions myself, which is any recommendations for you know, as educators or service providers, what we can tell people about selecting an attorney, like how do you find the right attorney for your situation, and also how can we help our clients prepare so that the time that they spend with attorneys is well spent. And I guess there's also the, you know, what's the red flag that you're not getting value from your attorney?
Sure. So I would say definitely look at your state bar and give them a call. That would probably be my first call if I was looking for somebody and I didn't know who to recommend for them, because your state bar can kind of help you figure out how to direct your farmer or rancher to somebody who will be most useful for them. They're probably not going to make just one recommendation. They'll probably make a couple. Most attorneys I know, we try to at least recommend 3 people generally, because we know not everybody is going to be a good fit for someone. So I would start there and just let them know a little bit, like, hey, I have a farmer who needs help with estate planning, or I have a farmer who has a food safety issue or something like that. And they can kind of direct you a little bit and help focus your effort to get that person to somebody that is going to be most helpful. I would say, in order to help maximize your time with an attorney, just attorney-client privilege means that we can't tell anybody anything that you tell us unless we're allowed to by you, or we're doing it like in court to defend you, that kind of thing. But we guard that very jealously. So you can trust your attorney and tell them anything that you need to tell them. Tell them everything. Don't hold anything back. Tell them all of the details. We need to hear that, because the smallest thing can be the thing that helps us get you out of your situation and into a better one. I can't give you any specific examples because I can't tell you any of the examples that I personally have, but I really, in terms of helping people maximize their time with a lawyer, just once you find one that's a good fit, tell them everything. They're not going to spill your secrets. They just need help. And the number of times, I can't think of the number of times that, like, I and other attorneys I know, like, will find out halfway through something, a tiny little detail that somebody didn't think to mention because they didn't think it was important, and it ends up being the thing that solves the whole problem. So being as open as you can and as you feel comfortable, I know that's troubling, especially when we're dealing with issues that go kind of right to the heart of everything that you're so invested in and that you're working on as growing food for people. But that can really be the thing that helps the most, I think.
We have one more question. I know we're a couple of minutes over, so quick answer. Do you know of any gender discrimination cases where females filed and were successful or not?
I don't want to jump off into the love case. I don't know if we'd define that as a success. It was sort of settled, so that might be one. That would be my quick answer, I guess. I mean, there was some relief available to people eventually after everything was said and done, so that might be. But that we could do a whole day's worth of presentations on all of those discrimination lawsuits for sure.
Well, thank you very much, Erin, for really information-packed session. As you all see, Erin's contact information was there, and it sounds like you're willing to field any follow-up questions directly. And
Definitely.
that we have about 7 minutes between now and our next presentation.
Great.
So thanks again.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Beth.
thank
Thanks,
you.
Erin.